I want to begin with an analogy, an analogous case to what we're faced with, what we're discussing now in connection with the advent or the already presence of AI in our world. And the analogy is that of developments in genetics and genetic science. More than 40 years ago, a book was published called What Sort of People Should We Be? It was by a man called Jonathan Glover, a philosopher at Oxford. And he was looking at the potential of this new technology of understanding the genome, of developing techniques of editing genes. And he was asking the question, what would we be prepared to do in the way of modifying human beings? What kind of controls, what sort of ethical questions are raised by thinking about this prospect? Now, this was back in the 1970s. This was long before any genome was sequenced, long before any gene editing techniques came to be feasible. And he was hoping that he could prompt a discussion. And indeed, discussions did take place whenever there was some event like the sequencing of the human genome or like the introduction of gene editing techniques that we've seen in just recent years. There's been an efflorescence of discussion, people thinking, what is the impact of this on our world, on ourselves, on human nature, and on the future? Now, you'd have thought 40 years ago that the imminence of this major technological and scientific advance in our world would prompt the world as a whole to get together and to try to set up something analogous to the Antarctic Treaty. You may remember back in 1959, about 20-odd countries got together and signed a treaty about what might happen in the Antarctic, how the resources there would be or wouldn't be exploited, how it might be protected. And as a result of that treaty, a number of other agreements have been reached internationally so that the Antarctic Treaty System, as it's now called, provides quite strong protections for the Antarctic and for the abundance of life in and underneath the Antarctic. You would think that something like that would have emerged out of the discussion about genetics, but it hasn't. And the fact that it hasn't teaches us a really important lesson when we think about what we might think about AI. There are lots of things, there are lots of lessons that can be learned, but I want to single out two. One is that one reason why the discussion about genetics and genetic engineering hasn't resulted in an overall agreement in our world about what's to be done, not even really in very satisfactory national, let alone international agreements, nor very satisfactory ideas about how those who were involved in genetic medicine or genetic engineering and genetics in general have set out for themselves certain kinds of policy controls or ethical controls of what they do. The reason why this hasn't happened is, as I say, well, the multiple, there are many different reasons, but the two that are significant for us are these. First, there were people who were tremendously scaremongering about the possibilities that genetic science offered. Many science fiction horror stories were proposed as one possible outcome of these developments. But on the other hand, there were people who were very laid back about it, very relaxed, rather insouciant. They thought, well, of course these things won't happen. Either we will never really be able to get to the kind of extent that the scaremongers are worried about, or we will find some sensible way of dealing with it. And in that debate between those two extremes, other people who were thinking about it took a position somewhere on the spectrum between them. And that debate resulted in a kind of decisional paralysis. The fact that there were people very adamant on both sides, the fact that the debate was premised on the future, on projections, on prophecies, on non-realities, because they hadn't really started to happen and to show us what could happen. The debate kind of ran into the sands, only to be temporarily revived when something came up, like, for example, the genome sequencing. But the second reason was this, that it is a truth, and it's a very worrying truth, and it's one that we really do need to address in the AI context, that anything that can be done will be done. It doesn't matter what efforts are made to try to limit it or stop it or prohibit it. If something can be done, it will be done. If genetic engineering ever gets to the point where you could take an embryo and you could engineer it so that it has a certain height, skin color, IQ level, athletic prowess, and so on, that will happen. Even if it's outlawed, there will be people, bad people or rich people, if they're any different, who will be very, very keen to make use of this kind of technology to get the end they want. So that idea, anything that can be done will be done, is a stark fact of our world, which has to lie at the very center of discussion about what we do. That is one reason why, back in 1959, when the Antarctic Treaty was first signed, people were aware of the fact that the resource riches of the Antarctic might prove too tempting ultimately, and despoilation of the Antarctic might result. And therefore, a very concerted effort was made to try to prevent it. But even that effort, when you look at it, you will notice that the agreements reached between countries about the Antarctic are time-limited. They're temporary. People are keeping their options open. It may very well be that there could be a scramble for bits of the Antarctic in the future when those treaties come into contact with realities and desires on the part of nations. So think about this fact. If it can be done, it will be done. It means that almost any technological advance can potentially move in the direction of the rather more scaremongering stories on the spectrum than the ones that people are very relaxed about. So let's think about how this applies to the case of AI. And do remember, by the way, that history teaches us an extremely valuable lesson about the advent of technologies. If you go right the way back to the invention of printing in the 15th century, within a mere decades of the first printing press, the Gutenberg printing press, there were printing presses in every major town and city in Europe, and tens of thousands of volumes were pouring off those presses. Think about the railway system in this country in the 19th century. The very first commercial railway service ran in the early 1830s. And by the end of the 1840s, there were thousands of miles of railways in this country. Think about the advent of mobile communications in our own time, just in the last couple of decades. What an extraordinary cascade effect there has been in the take-up of use of these technologies. So all these lessons teach us that when a new technology comes into existence, becomes possible, the take-up of it can be extremely quick, and it can be very transformative. Now, we've already passed a mark. AI is already a fact of our lives and our world, and has been for some time. You heard a little while ago the fact that pilots on our airlines have relatively little to do. One hopes, of course, that they're all reading treatises on ethics as they sit back in their cockpits. But there are so many respects in which AI is present. Let me mention one which, as it were, dramatizes the question about the if it can be done, it will be done point. And that is the use of AI in the development of military technology. We're already familiar, and have been for a number of years, with the operation of unmanned aerial military vehicles, drones, flying over Afghanistan now, piloted from an Air Force base in Nevada. Here's an example of a system, a technology. It's not totally an AI technology, but it does have a lot of AI on board. But this system is what is known as a human-in-the-loop system, because the drones are actually being flown by pilots back in the United States, and decisions to use the weaponry on those drones taken by people who discuss what the situation is, analyze the images that are being harvested from the scene of operations. Human in the loop. It's already the case that there are weapon systems in existence which are known as human on-the-loop systems. So, for example, the Phoenix anti-missile defense system, which is used by the United States Navy. This is a system very similar to the one used by the Israeli Defense Force against rockets coming in from Gaza, as it might be. So these are defense systems which are automatically triggered. There's no human being who's pulling a trigger, who's making a decision about whether to use them. The system is completely automatic. It is an AI-based system, but it has a human monitoring. So there's a human on the loop, as they say, in connection with these systems. 10 years ago, the United States Navy reported to a Senate hearing that they already had in development a human out-of-the-loop system, a completely automated weapons system for underwater patrolling. The development of these kinds of systems for on land and in the air weapons systems, which are known, by the way, in the usual way of these rather chilling acronyms as LAWS, LAWS, lethal autonomous weapons systems, depend crucially on the AI that they carry. Because these systems, since there is neither a human in the loop or on the loop, since it's a human out-of-the-loop system, has to be capable of making decisions in a theater of conflict on their own behalf. In particular, just to dramatize the point even further, a land-based LAWS has to be able to distinguish between a human being moving towards it who is surrendering and a human being moving towards it who's about to throw a hand grenade. It has to be able to distinguish between the human being stumbling towards it in the dust and fog and blinding, confusing fog of war, wounded, perhaps dazed, not knowing where he or she is going, and a human being making a deliberate path towards that system in order to try to disable it. The AI has to be sensitive enough in that system to make those sorts of discriminations if it's going to comply with humanitarian laws of war, which, as you know, turn on two principal features: principle of discrimination, being able to tell the difference between a combatant and a non-combatant, between a military asset and a non-military asset, and proportionality, as to whether the degree of force used by the system is actually appropriate to the circumstances. That's pretty sensitive AI. That would be a very remarkable step in the ability of AI systems to be able to do that kind of thing, to be able to take the place of a system, like a human being type system, able to make those sorts of discriminations and to come to those judgments. Now, these weapon systems are already in development, at least. Whether they are actually in deployment already is probably a matter which is under the wraps of official secrecy. But they are in development. We were told that a decade ago, as I say, and therefore AI implications for these sorts of decisions, these areas of our experience in the world are already here. They've already landed. The future is, as it were, behind us in these respects. So the great question about how we're to try to deal with this, how we're to distinguish between those areas of applications of AI which are such that they don't really involve major ethical or legal questions, and those where they do, is something which is of very considerable urgency. And it's therefore very heartening to see that this discussion is a live one, and that at a meeting like this, there are people who show that they're thinking about it very carefully and have been thinking about it for some time. But we have to notice a couple of things. The impact of AI, and in particular, the potential for the development of AGI, for artificial general intelligence, is such that this conversation really has to move into a different gear and take place on a much larger stage even than this one. Because it's not going to be good enough for companies like Google and Facebook and DeepMind to make decisions themselves about how they're to behave ethically. It's very good that they do. It's admirable that they do, and I take my hat off to them that they've set up ethics boards or ethics groups to discuss what they're doing. But commercial pressures and competitive pressures are such that they will have the inevitable effect of fraying the edges, at very least, of that determination on the part of the agencies themselves, who are setting out to be self-regulating in this respect. So it may not be good enough that the people who are doing the development of AI are thinking about these matters and trying to put in place some kind of self-control. Nor is it good enough if individual countries try to do it. If the United Kingdom, for example, tries to come up with laws or decisions, inhibitions, prohibitions relating to the development and application of AI systems of one kind or another. because of the point made earlier, because the thought that anything that can be done will be done makes a country very nervous that it might put itself behind in competitive advantage against those countries, and there are plenty of them around the world. One big example would, of course, be the People's Republic of China, who are much less anxious about ethical constraints and much more interested in the commercial and technological industrial advantages of being able to introduce these systems. So it's not enough for an individual state or nation to try to self-impose restrictions. And indeed, it's extremely unlikely that they ever would in a way that is definitive. What is needed is an Antarctic treaty on what might happen with AI. Or perhaps not a treaty. It's not that we should, in our anxiety about worst-case scenarios, try to get in the way of development and application of AI across a whole range of things. Obviously, AI is going to be an immense boost to our world. It's going to bring so many good things to our world that, of course, it should be supported, it should be encouraged, provision should be made for continuing research in it. But at the same time, an intelligent, reflective attitude towards it would prompt us, I think, to think a little bit about Antarctic-type agreements, to move with some caution in some areas, to think a little bit about what some of the worst-case scenarios might be, and to try to see how realistic they are, and if they do have any degree of realism about them, to try to do something about it. For example, it's a thought, a very natural thought, that if you had a super-intelligent system whose intelligence was general intelligence, so human-like intelligence, but multiplied many, 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 many times. And this prospect, by the way, is hardly a science fiction prospect, because you only have to imagine that a very intelligent system capable of creating yet more intelligent systems more intelligent than us creating yet more intelligent systems than them, might very well issue one day in an artificial general intelligence, which thought to itself the following: what is the thing which is most destructive and disruptive and annoying on planet Earth today? Well, the obvious answer is human beings, and it wouldn't take very long for that system to work out ways, since it could easily hack pretty well anything it wants to hack, like nuclear weapon systems and so on, to get rid of the human beings. If we were to think about the potential that AI offers us for extending the range of our knowledge and of our activities and of our resources into places, outer space, deep oceans, which human beings can't easily go to, but which AI systems might, and we think about the benefits that might accrue to us, we see the contrast, we see the difference between that kind of doomsday scenario where a super intelligent computer is thinking, let me get rid of these annoying human beings, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the extraordinary potential that AI offers us. And in between, about halfway along that spectrum, we can worry about the displacement of people from work, might think about the commitment that we would have to make to rearrange our social arrangements in our societies, perhaps social wages, perhaps extending opportunities for people to do things other than work, if most work, all the way from brain surgery to legal decisions, is taken over by artificial intelligence systems. So there's a great spectrum there, but almost all of the parts of that spectrum need reflection. They need contextualization. They need a plan. They need an Antarctic conversation about how we're going to accommodate this extremely powerful new set of technologies into our world, given that whatever use can be made of them will be made of them. So that is the important point we need to raise. Just a slightly different tack in thinking about the possibility of AGI, that is the one where we think of the kind of problems that a society might face if it had massive unemployment, let's say, or displacement of workforces in entire industries. That kind of problem is at least a familiar problem in outline, and we can think about the sorts of responses that we might make to it. But thinking about what might happen with AGI, and an AGI which was self-reflective enough in a way to represent to itself that it has certain interests, like, for example, continuing to exist so that it would resist any efforts to switch it off if it became too dictatorial, let us say. If we were to think of those kind of doomsday scenarios and ask ourselves the question, how do we cope with that? How do we imagine our relationship to such systems in the future? What aspect of an Antarctic discussion about that side of AI could we have? And it raises for us the real importance, the very, very great importance of exploring the concept of intelligence, exploring the concept of intelligent systems, and exploring the concept of how natural wetware-based intelligence of our kind can relate to that kind of intelligence. It might also, of course, raise questions about what would happen in future if our successors in the human story are in fact combinations of wetware and hardware, incorporating AI into themselves, which is a real possibility already. What kind of conversation might that be? What sorts of things would need to be taken into account if we were to think of that way of looking at the potential future of AI under government of that thought, that if it could happen, then it will happen? And the answer is this. It means that we have to redouble our efforts to understand the nature of consciousness, of mental phenomena, of intelligence, the kind of things that we feel that we are subjectively very familiar with, but which we really don't have any very, very good, complete, or satisfying objective account as yet, despite the great advances that have been made in our understanding, for example, of brain function by functional MRI scans and the work done in psychoneurology. And the reason for thinking that this is an area of inquiry which needs to be pursued vigorously alongside work in AI and development of AGI is this, that minds are not the same thing as brains. And I don't mean this in a kind of Cartesian dualist sense, not suggesting that there is a mental substance independent of physical substance. After all, if you hit somebody on the head hard enough, they do tend to stop thinking for at least a bit. So we know that there is a very intimate connection between brain function and the mental output associated with that brain. What I mean by saying that mind is not quite the same thing as a brain is best explained by saying that each one of us individually, our minds are things that exist in relationship with a natural physical environment around us and an environment of other minds. So in order to explain mental phenomena, you have to explain a relationship or a set of relationships. We upload into our brains a very great deal from our social environment and from the other minds around us. We upload it through acquisition of language, for example, but also through experience and the laying down of memories. And we become tapped into or plugged into a very rich and extensive cultural environment as well as physical environment. And all our mental lives, almost all aspects of our mental lives, have to do with that relationship. So it's not simply a matter of the activation of structures in the brain. When you look at brain activity, you can see correlations between structures in the brain and certain psychological capacities and episodes. But that cannot be the whole story. The whole story has to associate those psychological capacities with what happens when an individual human being interacts with a social environment, a physical environment, and with other minds. So this tells us that there is a huge amount to be learned when we think about the nature of mind, and in particular, the nature of conscious or intelligent mentation, and how we are to develop artificial general intelligence, which, at least in part, manages to capture some of those capacities and abilities that human minds have. If we wanted to be able to encourage systems that teach themselves to be intelligent, to pick up on facts like the intentional behavior of other agents, and particularly non-mechanical agents, so animals, human beings, and the natural environment in general, able sensitively to discriminate between, let us say, just being about to be attacked by it or being confused and and lost in a war zone, that kind of capacity that a weapons system, an autonomous weapons system needs to have, then we need to understand what it is that we want the machine to try to teach itself. We need to be able to put those developing self-teaching artificial intelligence systems into environments where they learn how to connect with other environments and other perspectives so that they can mimic in the required way the sort of things that we can do as human beings in acquiring, having, and operating minds. So the work in AI, which is computing-based, which is engineering-based, most of which in its practical applications so far, at any rate, goes through the conduit of practical applications, needs to have alongside it these two other discussions. The Antarctic Treaty discussion about how, as an international community of human beings, we're going to think sensitively, intelligently, generously, taking into account all the huge possibilities that AI offers, but at the same time, looking at some of the worst-case scenarios also. And secondly, to not plunge into thinking that we're going to be able to create artificial general intelligence before we've got very far with understanding human intelligence or the nature of the human mind, because we haven't. We haven't got anywhere near to a point of understanding that would be satisfactory and which would help us to understand what an artificial mind or a machine-based mind might be like, how it might operate, and how we could relate to it. So there are a number of different points there. There's no point in trying to bootstrap ourselves up by saying we should program in or we should place in parameters which are specifically ethical kind without agreement on what we mean by the ethical constraints that we would like to build in. After all, ethical discussions very often throw up the fact that there are very different views in different sectors of the same society, let alone between different societies. So there too, the Antarctic discussion about the nature of the good for our world in general and human beings in it needs to take place. So there's a lot still to be done, a lot still to be discussed outside the computing and engineering aspects of this. And to remember the analogy of the debate about genetic engineering, to think about the fact that that discussion has been going on for a very long time and it hasn't really got anywhere yet. The fact that individual agencies like pharmaceutical companies or medical research institutions haven't themselves been able to influence the debate, the overall debate, to the extent of an Antarctic Treaty-style conclusion, should teach us something about the debate in AI. And given the fact that unlike the genetics debate, AI is already here and already operative in so many ways, that discussion needs to generalize and it needs to speed up. Thank you very much.